And what do you see as some of the common reasons that conflict can arise from grief?
Again, they can be very complicated and very complex, and I think it's important to consider the pre-existing relationship that person had. And this is where it's multi-layered, because we start with ourselves in terms of thinking, or maybe I'm not dealing with this very well, or I'm dealing with it too well.
I imagine it's far easier to be silent and not to have conversations than actually have sometimes to face those conversations with someone. Welcome to the Life and Loss podcast, where we break down barriers surrounding discussions of death and grief, making listeners feel less alone. Today I'm joined by Liz, a psychotherapist based at Forest Holme Hospice. And in this episode, we will discuss family conflict after someone has died. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me today. So we're here to talk about grief after someone's died and the disputes and the conflict that may occur from that. The assumption is that when someone dies, the family will pull together, support each other, but we know from experience that that's not always the case. How can grief bring on existing tensions and bring up past experiences within a family?
Well, I think the important thing to say is that everybody's experience of the person that has died is a unique one, as was the relationship that they had with that person before they died. So I think that is often where the conflict can occur, because everybody, even with good intentions, can have sometimes very strong opinions and can make assumptions and have expectations, as we can have on ourselves as well, about how this person should be grieving. And I have certainly seen people where, and I'm thinking about one particular person who had a sense of being sent for counselling by her daughter, because her daughter didn't feel that she was coping, but actually she thought she was coping very well. So I think when we start to compare our own experience of losing that person to how we think somebody else should be dealing with it, then I think that can often be where conflict arises.
And what do you see as some of the common reasons that conflict can arise from grief?
Again, they can be very complicated and very complex, and I think it's important to consider the pre-existing relationship that person had with the person before they died. So if there were issues around, for example, domestic violence, substance abuse, estrangement, those can often be factors which, when that person then dies, can exacerbate the complexities of that loss for that person.
And how about the way in which people grieve? We know that some people can be really emotional, other people want to be more stoic and just kind of get on with it. Can that cause tension as well?
Yeah, that's really important, because again, thinking about the pre-existing relationship before that person died. So if there were issues in the relationship, for example, around domestic violence or substance misuse, that can be a complicating factor. But also that person's natural style of dealing with a very stressful event isn't necessarily going to change, because in this particular instance, that stressful event is the death of somebody.
Yeah.
So if somebody was stoic, as you say, in all events that have been stressful in their lives, and gender is important here, because we often do see elder men being more stoic, partly because traditionally men are historically certainly less comfortable in talking about how they feel. That's changing now, but also as a generation, the younger people are now more encouraged to talk about how they feel. So stoicism is a really good example of that. But actually, how you naturally deal with stressful events is very likely to be the way in which you deal with the stressful event of losing a loved one. So if you were somebody who was more comfortable in being busy and keeping yourself very active as a way of distracting yourself, then that's what's likely to happen. And that's an interesting example because often after a death, those first few weeks can be very, very busy. There'll be funerals to arrange. You'll have family members maybe coming to stay that you wouldn't ordinarily have. And then, of course, when some of that busyness stops, then the person's left with having to deal with the kind of the loss of that person.
Yeah. Do you see people comparing who's the most upset and who's crying more or who's carrying on?
Yes, see that very common. And again, I have a person that springs to mind for that because they felt that they saw other people crying more and they found it difficult to cry over the death of this loved one. They had a sense that they thought, and this is where it's multi-layered, because we start with ourselves in terms of thinking, or maybe I'm not dealing with this very well, or I'm dealing with it too well. And then we look to other people and they'll let us know, they might do it with good intention, about their opinion of how they think we're dealing with the situation. And that can complicate things. So if somebody sees somebody crying and they're not crying, then they might begin to question whether, am I grieving for this person in the right way? And actually I have had somebody say to me that it made them feel like it questioned the quality of the relationship that they'd had with that person that died. Did their lack of crying mean that they didn't love that person in the way that they had thought that they did? So it's very complicated at times.
Yeah. I hope that you're finding this episode helpful as you navigate through your own grieving journey. Grief is deeply personal and often isolating. If you'd like to share your own thoughts and experiences, please comment below. And have you got any other real life examples of how grief has torn a family apart or created a huge conflict?
I certainly can give you some themes around estrangement, step families and blended families. That can often complicate a situation, especially when there's children involved from previous marriages. And again, if there's issues around money, for example, inheritance, depending on the age of the person that has died, if property or accommodation is in question, if people have a sense of fairness and what's right or entitlement and that's different to other people's, that can significantly cause conflict, with often people feeling that they're stuck in the middle of trying to keep everybody happy on behalf of the person that's actually died, believing that this is not what the person who's died would want. So,
and those people that are grieving, they're going through so much already, having that extra layer of having conflict on top. What impact can that have on people and have on children as well?
Quite significant impact. I mean, because of the nature of our service, we can see people who unfortunately have actually experienced multiple losses as well. And what we can see is the unresolved loss, maybe because of the circumstances around that person, can then be enacted in other losses. So people might say something like, oh, but I lost my mum 5 years ago. I should be over that now. And now I've lost my friend and all I find myself is thinking about my mum and I feel guilty because I'm not thinking about my friend. So conflict can actually shut down communication between people that might enable those people, despite their desires to be closer to each other, it can actually make people have greater distance, especially if they're not living locally. So there's more frequency to kind of have contact with that person and spend more time with them on a more informal basis.
So Liz, what advice would you have for people to communicate better and to better support each other?
I think what happens in the therapy room can actually be organised outside of the therapy room. And I often will say to people, for me, the magic of having therapy is what happens in between appointments. It's not just the hour that you have with that person, it's what do they do with those conversations and the thoughts and the reflections that they have had as a result of that conversation. So actually having conversations with those people that are dear to you, but actually putting some parameters around that. And I think that the biggest thing I would say is the importance of respecting that somebody else's experience of that loss is going to be different to yours. Not right, not wrong, not better, not worse, but it's going to be significantly different. And so being able to demonstrate your respect of that, I think, is a good first step to opening up communication. But putting parameters around where you have the conversation, often going in a more neutral place rather than in that person's home, can be helpful. Often doing an activity, let's go for a coffee, let's go for a walk. So where there's that medium to kind of communicate through, that can often help people to just feel more relaxed. And again, I think what's really important is giving each other permission to call time on the conversation.
Yeah.
So if you feel yourself becoming maybe more upset or more tearful or more angry or more anxious, that it's okay to say, I think we've done our best for today. Let's leave it for now and we'll come back to this. Because I think that whole process of setting a conversation up to enable it to be at its best is actually going to be more fruitful over the longer term. And that's what happens in therapy, of course. You know, people, we can touch base with somebody and say, how is this conversation going? And they can say, well, it's really more uncomfortable than I imagined. So you can move on to a different subject. But yeah.
I imagine it's far easier to be silent and not to have conversations than actually have sometimes to face those conversations with someone. At that point, if the conversations aren't happening, is it important to get help from somewhere outside your family?
It can be. I think what's been fed back quite consistently since I've been working at Forest Holme is the difference of that therapeutic relationship, because when the relationship is personal, people are very often editing what they say because they want to protect the other person and they want to protect the relationship. So actually they will say nothing as a means of not having conflict or the situation escalating. But it doesn't mean, of course, that they're not feeling something. So coming to therapy at a time where you think either I'm not functioning as well as I think I should be, for example, caring for the children, going back to work, picking up some of my normal interests, or relationships aren't moving forward in the way that everybody wants, can often be a time when bringing in somebody who's more neutral. Our role is to be impartial.
Yeah.
Our role is to ensure that the views of all individuals are heard. And not to act as a mediator, that's not the role of therapy, but to actually give people the opportunity to have a say, talk about how they feel in a safe environment.
And finally, Liz, if someone listening to this podcast today is in the middle of a situation where the family's fallen apart, do you have any advice for them?
I was going to say reach out and ask for help, but that's not as straightforward.
Yeah.
Again, because if you are the kind of person who has been confident in your lifetime in reaching out and asking for help, that would be a natural thing to do, would be to either speak to a friend or seek professional help. But actually, if you're somebody who has always kept things very private, reaching out and asking for help would be quite challenging. But there'll be different contexts. So it could be the work, could be a place where you're able to talk to somebody and say, I'm struggling, I need some help. You might get some advice from them. So being open when people are offering you different avenues or signposting you to different places to get help, be open to giving it a go, really.
Thank you so much. And thank you for listening to the Life and Loss podcast. If you'd like more information on our work, you can visit our website, which is foresthomehospice.org.uk. Thank you. Grief is a journey that none of us should navigate alone. If today's interview resonated with you, or if you know someone who could benefit from hearing it, I'd encourage you to subscribe and share this podcast. By spreading the word, you help us to reach others who may be grieving, letting them know that they're not alone and that there's a community here to support them.